So, good evening, everyone. Sorry, it's evening here, but good morning, good afternoon across the world. The topic of today's webinar is how can I use RecMap to tailor recommendations to my own setting or my own decision. And I'm Joseph Matthew from India, and I work with the Guidelines International Network and also several other bodies. These are some of my disclosures. None of these are actually financially committed. These are all academic pursuits, and I don't receive money from any of them, but that's by way of the disclosures. Now, I must also admit that I thought there would be a lot of people from the developing world in this particular webinar. So I've tailored my presentation to suit that audience more. So those who are familiar with guideline development, adolopment process, you might find this a bit boring, but sit back and relax, have a short snooze if necessary, and Miloslav will actually talk to us about how they do adolopment in their setting. Now, to plunge ahead, if you remember the early days of the pandemic, if you throw your minds back 18 or 24 months, there was a lot of problem in the sense that we didn't know much about this virus, the disease that it caused. There was a lot of panic amongst stakeholders in the healthcare sector and otherwise. In fact, this was more like a panic-demic than just a pandemic. Politics was outweighing science, so science took a back seat there. There were limited resources in terms of materials. In fact, countries like ours didn't even have enough of hand-rub solution or masks for that matter. And then as months progressed, the information that started seeping in was actually drowned pretty much by the misinformation and the disinformation. So it became a mis plus dis infodemic, as it were. And so, not surprisingly, at that time, there were a lot of clinical interventions which were tried, and this thing shows up a list of those which were later proven definitely not to work. And these are very nicely documented on Wikipedia in a page called List of Unproven Methods Against COVID-19. But the point is that a lot of these things also found their way into guidelines, which were issued at the levels of national governments, state governments, and even countries like ours and other developing countries. These were actually given the sanctity of being a guideline, which was promoted, recommended by the government itself. And then there was in China this habit of using CT scan as a diagnostic test and things like that. These clinical interventions by themselves were probably just the tip of the iceberg because there were hundreds of non-clinical interventions, ranging from homemade solutions for hand rub to weird solutions, bizarre solutions in some cases, which were marketed, promoted, and sold. But they were not all clinical interventions, so they really remained outside the realm of science or any kind of evidence. Now, against that backdrop, it was argued, therefore, that we should have a lot of guidelines which are evidence-based. And this publication in Anguish in the Lancet Global Health in mid-2021 said that there is an urgent need for looking at this evidence-informed medicine in India and, of course, other developing countries, and emphasize that guidelines should actually be based on evidence and be responsive to local situations and things like that. Now, in response to that, I submitted to the journal that actually there is a plethora of guidelines in countries like ours, but the problem is that they're not scientific guidelines. They're not designed to address questions which should be answered scientifically. These are so-called administrative guidelines which policymakers and leadership released at the time of a confusing situation. And then these became, kind of gained the sanctimony of being some kind of a guideline, which could be used both in the clinical as well as in the public health sectors. So the problem with having evidence-based guidelines in the developing countries are numerous. And some of them, of course, overlap with the problems which were faced by the developed healthcare systems, which have agencies and bodies for these guidelines as well. And of course, first was urgency, because everybody wanted a quick fix. There was no time to collect, collate, sift through the evidence. There was no evidence in the first place. So urgency was something which grappled both the developed healthcare systems as well as the developing healthcare systems. And then, of course, the other big issue was the influences and pressures. The developed countries and their guideline networks were faced with pressures which came from healthcare stakeholders and leaders on what should be their priorities and what guidelines should be addressed. The developing countries face the pressures of trying to kowtow to the guidelines which were produced by the developed world, in addition to their own internal and external pressures and situations. But outside of these, there were a set of unique problems which are faced in developing countries, and that is whether guidelines should be scientific exercises or administrative exercises. By administrative, I mean that healthcare policy leaders and the governments needed to issue some kind of statements which would be followed across the domain that they were looking after in their jurisdiction, whether it's a whole country or a region or a state or a healthcare system. So very often they produced documents within hours or days, which were called guidelines, but they were pretty much actually administrative documents, not backed by any science at all, and just something for people to fall back on and for governments and leaders to be seen to be doing something. The other problem is that the developing countries have this thing that I call the curse of the consensus. Now, consensus building in a guideline is actually a formal process, whereas in much of the developing world, consensus is usually taken as the absence of dissent. So you have a room full of people in which one or two voices are dominating, they do all the talking, the rest don't say anything. And because there was no active dissent or disagreement, it is taken as a consensus. And a lot of guideline documents or the so-called guideline documents in countries like ours are actually based on this consensus, which if you looked at it very carefully is the voice of one or two people who are dominating that group. And then a lot of guidelines were tried to be picked up, as it were, from healthcare settings in the developed world, and WHO helped us to do this. But then that didn't work so well in our settings because it would be like putting a square peg into a round hole. There would be sometimes a fit, but sometimes not a fit, and sometimes, of course, it didn't work at all. And then came this big issue in our countries, wherein people like to have guidelines. The population and the stakeholders like to be told what to do. They might choose not to do it, like this picture shows, wherein it's necessary to wear helmets for pillion seat riders as well on two-wheeled bicycles and motorcycles. But nobody really looks at the implementation part of it, even though the rule or the legislation or the guideline is there. So people like to be told what to do. They don't want to go through the process of thinking it through for themselves, unlike empowered societies in the developed world. They might choose to do it or not choose to do it, but everyone wants to have some kind of a guideline, some kind of a rule. And this is a situation that developing countries, especially India and others, have been facing in this era of the COVID pandemic, wherein there is a lot of interventions that are available. There is a lot of guideline-like documents which have been produced and disseminated widely by prestigious scientific bodies within the countries as well as governments. And yet, these are not really guidelines and their implementation is totally lacking. That brings me to my first poll question, wherein all of you have to answer this. I'm going to request Dilhara to pop this question up on your screens. It's basically whether any of this sounds familiar to your healthcare setting or it's totally alien to what you are experiencing. Please take a few seconds and let's have the poll up and see the results. Thank you, Dilara.
Yes, poll is now launched. Okay, we have responses coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds.
All right, that sounds good. It looks like what I'm saying seems to be making some kind of sense. It's not completely alien, I think. Yeah, and actually many in the developed world also face some of these situations, So I think.
Yeah, so I will end the poll now and share the results. Sorry.
Yeah, that looks good, right? So thank you. It looks like people are familiar with what I'm trying to say. Yeah, thank you, Dilara. Should we close the poll?
Yes, I'll go ahead and stop sharing it. Yeah, back to you, Joseph.
Thanks very much. So how do I get this off the screen now? The poll, I mean. My slide.
Just move to the next slide.
Okay, my slide doesn't advance because of, I think, this thing which is on the screen. Okay, thank you. That's it. So, despite all this, there were guidelines which were available from good scientifically produced guidelines, but some of them had limitations. And when we looked at a bunch of pediatric guidelines as almost a year back, this was the work of one of my students, we found 62 guidelines that could be applied in India. And we looked at their overall agree scores. But the sad thing was that most of these guidelines really were of poor quality and did not meet that expected criterion of having good agree scores. In fact, if you looked at 60% as the so-called cutoff for a good quality guideline, only 3 of those 62 actually crossed the threshold of 60%. One or two reached close, but the majority of them had very low agree to scores, and the median was only 35%. Interestingly, when we looked further at the guidelines which were produced in the initial part of the pandemic, the first half of the guidelines, compared to the second half, believing that the pressure of time might have created some problems with the quality of those guidelines, we discovered no differences in any of the domain scores, at least no statistically significant differences between guidelines that were produced early in the pandemic and those that were produced later in the pandemic. Even more surprising was the fact that 9 of these 62 guidelines actually had updates, which means later in the pandemic, the same bodies produced updated versions of those guidelines. And even these updated guidelines did not meet the quality criteria. And there were no statistically significant differences between the original versions and the updated versions. And this is curious because these guidelines agencies which produce these guidelines are otherwise very prestigious and reputed. And there is some empiric evidence that for COVID, the overall quality of the guidelines seems to be even lower. In other words, we couldn't even rely on guidelines which were produced by prestigious agencies, published, available in the public domain because of these kind of issues. So it was in that kind of a setting that the RecMap that Holger talked about so extensively in the last webinar came like a breath of fresh air. And I'm just showing you a screenshot of what the map looks like. The URL is put there right at the bottom of that slide. So this RecMap has got hundreds, rather thousands of recommendations which have been pulled out from guidelines which have been completely appraised by a team. And pretty much all domains are being covered over there, which are in the columns above. And on the rows below, there is almost scores of options from which people can just go click on a particular box or cell. And each of these cells represents the number of guideline recommendations that are available on that particular topic. And because this was covered at great length the last time, I will not go into greater detail with this, but suffice it to say that people like me had a sigh of relief because we thought now people in the developing world just need to look at this and do the right thing. And the great thing about this RecMap is that it fulfills the 3 A's which are so critical to the developing world, and that is it's available. Nobody needed to do the heavy lifting for that in our part of the world. It's accessible at the click of a button. Anyone with an internet connection can get to it. And it's completely affordable because there is no drain of resources in terms of money or time to access this. So it's a beautiful resource and should work very well. But I was, kind of put off to learn that people in our country were not using this. So the guideline recommendations were available, but they were not being implemented. This was like having a highway which is soaring up into the sky, but then it doesn't go anywhere. It just remains there. So the gap between the recommendations availability and the implementation led us to wonder why these were not being implemented. So we took a side project with some support from Guidelines International Network, and we extracted recommendations from the RecMap on a broad variety of issues like pediatric age group, pregnancy, etc., etc. There were hundreds of these. Then we pulled out the formal recommendations, and then we surveyed a bunch of end users, mostly clinicians, to find out their level of implementation of these guidelines and also whether these guideline recommendations were acceptable to them in their healthcare setting. And the work is still ongoing, but I'm sharing some preliminary results. As of 1st October 2021, we had 40 formal pediatric recommendations on the map. They covered a range of topics like this, mostly useful to clinicians. But 20 out of those 40 were related to vaccines. Our country didn't have vaccination for the pediatric age group at that time, so these didn't help us. The rest of them looked like this. So out of these 24 recommendations, which are shown on the x-axis here, which is at the base, I'm not listing the recommendation, but these are 24 recommendations from the RecMap. We asked a simple question: are you aware of these recommendations? And the proportion of people who are not aware at all is shown in these blue bars. So for some recommendations, it was as low as 10% of the physicians or clinicians. For some, it was as much as 80%. And the pink bars actually show people who were not implementing that recommendation, either because of lack of awareness or some other reason. So a lot of these excellent recommendations which are available were not being implemented in our setting at all. So the next question we looked into is why not? And don't try to read this slide, it's very busy. But when we looked at this, we found that the majority of the reasons were actually revolving around differences in the PICOT in the local setting versus the PICOT in the evidence-based guideline recommendation, and the mismatch between these two PICOTs, either at the level of the population that they were talking about, or the intervention itself, or the comparison, or the outcomes they were looking at were different, because of which some of these were not being implemented. There were also, in the developing setting that we are talking about, alternate interventions that were available, which were not covered in the original recommendations, and therefore that became one reason for it as well. Then we went further and asked this population of clinicians, now that you know the right thing to do, would you be willing to change your practice to align with this particular set of evidence-based recommendation? And these blue bars actually represent the people who said yes, they would be willing to change. And the red is people who said they would not be willing to change. So you can see that the red is slightly in minority to the blue, but there's still a significant number of physicians who said that despite the availability of good quality evidence-based recommendations, there are some hesitations in changing practice to align with those. So we looked at that further and we tried to figure out what's the reason that people are not willing to change practice despite having the high quality recommendations with them. And they were again wide and varied. It included things ranging from strength of the recommendation not being appropriate for people in the local setting, to the strength of the evidence not being enough, to all kinds of other reasons, again to do with the PICOT components of the question on which the recommendations were framed. And then we asked two specific questions towards the end of our survey, and that is the recommendation such that you find it totally unacceptable to you for use in your local healthcare setting? And these are the proportion of responses which said for their setting, people would not be happy to use that recommendation at all. It would be totally unacceptable. Again, ranging from 5% to as much as 25%. But the key thing is, when we framed the same question slightly differently and asked if the same recommendation had some modifications, which means it was more tailored to be used in your healthcare setting, would you then find it acceptable? Those numbers jumped up by 3 or 4 times, which means that it's not the recommendation per se which people are unwilling to use or finding it difficult to implement in their own setting. It is modifications which are required within the recommendation to make it tailor-made to their setting. In other words, I think the global recommendations don't always fit the local setting, even though they serve the broad purpose. Like this picture shows, it's some kind of footwear, but the shoe is not really fitting the foot for which it has been designed. And therefore, the whole question now opens up. If you had a situation like this, wherein the evidence-based recommendations were not implementable in your own setting, what could you do or what would you do? Dilara, we can put the poll up now for people to see and take a look.
Launched poll.
Thank you. So the options are given up over there, and one is, that we would frame a new guideline entirely and have tailor-made local recommendations. The other option is, to use it all the same, and so on and so forth. So the last option is if you would choose some other approach, in which case, if you could type in the chat box what that alternate approach would be, that would be kind of helpful.
So answers are still coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds.
Okay, we have the results, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the majority would modify or tweak the recommendation to suit the local context. That's a good way of going forward. Some would go for entirely new guideline development, and some would actually use the recommendations anyway and just hope for the best. No one has chosen the last approach, which we'll talk about in a second. Thank you, Dilara. Should I proceed?
Yes, you can.
Okay, the slides are stuck again. There it is. So you're right. These are pretty much what we would do. The de novo recommendation development is like reinventing the wheel, and it's a great thing, but the wheel can sometimes crush the person who invented it under its own weight. And despite those challenges, we in India actually have a COVID India Guidelines Network group, which have reinvented the wheel and looked at all these interventions all over again. And we have built up recommendations on each of these, and they are available on our website. So it's not efficient. It's not the best use of resources, time, manpower, but that's one approach which has been taken. The other approach is, adopt as it is, which is like a copy paste. You pick up the recommendation from some other setting, you implement it in your own setting, and then kind of hope for the best. It's like a copy paste exercise. Sometimes works, sometimes does not work. The third approach, of course, is the tweaking or the nip and tuck kind of a thing. But there is a formal process for this as well. And very often we in the developing world do this nipping and tucking business, but we don't really get the right way to do it. And then we end up with things which are flawed in some way. And the fourth approach, which is where I will very soon be handing over to Miloslav, is this new term, at least in our kind of a healthcare system, which is called the adolopment process, when you can use recommendations from somewhere and do a mixture of all the three things that I said previously and adolop them for your own local setting. So the big learning lessons that we had from this whole exercise, and what I'm trying to summarize here, is that having the recommendations available, accessible, and affordable in one place is only half the story. Even disseminating them is not enough. It will be focused on the implementation. And there's a huge set of challenges in implementing good quality evidence-based recommendations in the local healthcare systems and settings that we in the developing country are facing. I think my time is up. So I will stop over here and stop sharing and pass on to Miloslav. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for excellent presentation and a great introduction to what I will talk concretely, showing example of the development of our guideline. I'm just double check that I'm sharing the full screen of my slide.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, excellent. So hello, everyone. I see there are participants all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's great that you found time and you came for this webinar session. And I will just continue exactly on what was presented by Joseph. And this presentation will be focused on support for clinical and policy decision makers. What is the process of adoloping recommendations? I'm coming from the Czech National Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare and Knowledge Translation, which is an umbrella for Cochrane, Czech Republic, Czech JBI Center of Excellence, Masaryk University Great Center, also from Czech Health Research Council, and Institute of Health Information and Statistics of the Czech Republic. There are a few disclosures I have for the beginning. I don't have any direct financial conflict of interest. However, there are a few organizations I'm working with, I'm involved with them, and they're intellectually influencing, of course, what I'm presenting. Regarding the recommendation map, I'm co-investigator and member of executive plan language recommendation and transformation teams regarding the e-COVID-19 RecMap project and the other disclosures you could see on the screen. So this session is session number 2. So within the first session, it was Holger Schunemann who was explaining and showing about the RecMap. Now, in the first part, Joseph introduced and showed some of the hints and tricks how to use the RecMap. And I will be presenting how we developed by the adolopment approach, the national Czech Republic COVID-19 guidelines. So the first will be a few basic information about our approach in the Czech Republic to guideline development, also our approach to COVID-19 guidelines, a decision for adolopment from e-COVID RecMap, overall process of adolopment and adolopment challenges and also advantages. So within our national guideline process, you see it's quite complex from this slide. There is involved Ministry of Health of the Czech Republic. There is involved Czech Research Council, Institute for Information and Statistics. Our guidelines are going through several approval approaches, and we work directly with Czech professional medical societies in developing of them. But what methodology to use for national guideline development, we decided not to reinvent the wheel and use the best what exists. So our national guideline methodology is based on the GenMec master checklist and mainly on the GRADE methodology. In the meantime, it was already several times updated because the guideline methodologies are developing and quite fast. So since 2018, we already have the version 2.2 for our national guideline methodology. Well, what was the approach in our country to COVID-19 guidelines? Where the first discussions with several relevant stakeholders and policy makers was even the discussion if we need COVID-19 guidelines in March 2020. And there were maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, some arguments against. I think all of you remember how COVID-19 started, and then there were many different articles and research published in preprints and different servers, not all of them of very high certainty, rather low certainty. And those were some arguments why actually we don't know the guidelines from some of the groups. Of course, arguments for, which are arguments which are sound, is the heterogeneity of provided care in our hospitals. Unfortunately, we've seen many not very good examples. So with the guideline can avoid silly and potentially dangerous interventions, which unfortunately happened in some of our settings. And of course, very low certainty of evidence and poor quality and credibility of some of the research. However, robust guideline development can actually help to distinguish from the high quality research and low quality research and inform the guidelines and recommendation. Well, then it was quite a long time. Within this long time, there were developed several rather statements of professional societies than real guidelines. And finally, in July 2021, decision was made to develop the trustworthy national COVID-19 guidelines. To this, I would say better late than never. And I'm glad that this decision finally came. So right now, we actually finished the first version of our guideline. It's completely by the method of adoloping from the RecMap. Totally, or in the end, there were included 8 guidelines which were identified through the RecMap, 83 recommendations and good practice statements, and 7 new or de novo developed recommendations and good practice statements which were developed by our team. This guideline will be published on our national portal after peer review process rounds on March 2022 in our national portal. So how our methodological team actually started before the RecMap was set up and it revealed its first results. Well, we ourselves were searching systematically the sites we do usually. For COVID-19, we identified about 60 relevant databases. And we started with this. However, as I informed, the national guideline truly started in July 2021, although we were ready much earlier. And then it was quite clear and easy decision for us because we said, well, here is such great source as a e-COVID recommendation map, which is living. So there were no doubts that we will use this source as our main guidelines, and we agreed on this with our panels and colleagues within the COVID-19 panel. Well, arguments for the RecMap, there are plenty of arguments. One of the very strong ones is developed by a huge international team, very experienced in a guideline and systematic review development from all over the world, basically. One of the arguments, another argument is, this is the current screenshot, I think, from today. So you can see that currently on the map, we have about 4,980 citations. There is 317 guidelines, which are appraised by agreed to score, extracted on the map. And there is 4,333 recommendations right now. So this is the huge repository of the living repository of the guidelines. Well, overall process for adolopment from the RecMap. For all of you, and you were introduced to it in the first sessions, there is the adolopment button, so you can request adolopment within the RecMap. However, we knew from the beginning that our project will not be only about one recommendation or few recommendations. We knew it will be much more. So for this, we had a meeting with the RecMap extraction IT team. So we asked for this meeting, and the colleagues immediately replied. Then with this team, we agreed our approach of actually how to identify the relevant recommendations. So we basically identify the recommendation and send the list to IT team. IT team developed the testing environment within the GradePro for our team, so we could a little bit play with it, get familiarized ourselves and our panel members with it. And then we send, after the searching of the RecMap, we send the final list of the Recs URLs to the IT team, and they set up for us the project for the check adolopment within the GradePro. And since that, we very effectively were able to work with all evidence which was already extracted and appraised on the map. So then on our check side, there were several methodological presentations about the RecMap to our guideline panel. We were showing how actually the guideline panel can use the features of the RecMap. So there were the searching trial and also tutorial developed by us to the guideline panel, so they could work with it and online. And their task was to identify relevant recommendations. Of course, on the RecMap, there are several different types of recommendations. So our approach and preferences were that if you find more recommendations on the map, then follow the agree score, go for a score which is about the 60%. If there is not such recommendation, go below 60%. If there is no recommendation, go to the good practice statement. If there is no good practice statement, then additional guidance. So in the end, we were able to find an answer to most of our question. This is the definition, which I believe was already presented in the first session. However, this is how we distinguish on the RecMap different types of recommendations, and that is a agree score. But I will not explain this again, as this was already explained. So overall process for adolopment on the RecMap, which is continue. So then actually our GradePro trial, and we developed GradePro trial and tutorial for our guideline panels. Some of them had experience using the GradePro already, some not. For some, it was very new. So we prepared the guide, which I will and tutorial, which I will show you shortly, just as example. Then the turning on the adolopment mode for each of the section of recommendations, and there were hot links to the methodology. So we were on the phone to our panel members, helping them when they were working on the within the GradePro. Those adoloped recommendations, we translated them, we contextualized, and where there were new evidence, we implemented, and all changes which we made and used in a Czech language, because in Czech Republic we use a Czech language, not English as a first language. So everything we translated into Czech language, contextualized, and then translated into English if there were any changes. So those changes will be then visible back on the RecMap. Guideline panels, they were working in a smaller teams, working on a concrete guideline questions, and there were constant methodological consultations from our methodological team. Then there were a methodological check from the adolopt recommendations, guarantor check, and then the whole panel review. After the whole panel review, there was approval for a guideline for all changes and adaptations which were done. All recommendations reached 100% consensus, but one recommendation which reached 60% consensus for it. Internal approval processes, we have several, as I showed, we have quite, I would say, complex and robust processes. So the first, our guarantee committee, national guideline project, that is the first approval. Then there is an external peer review process. Then we have a public review. All relevant stakeholders are invited to look to the guideline and make the critique and comments. And then there is a final approval by the guarantee committee. And this is exactly where we are. So currently our guideline is in an external peer review process, which hopefully will finish in a few days, and then it's going to public review. New recommendations which were developed will be extracted back on the Grade Pro, and it will be waiting for a check and validation by the RecMap extraction team. So in the end, everyone will be able to find the recommendation in a Czech language also on the RecMap. And that's what we are now discussing within the executive and other teams of the RecMap project. So here is example of the tutorial what we prepared for our panel members. So this is just the basic legend what we prepared, and then actually the print screens and also the video, short video, and the presentation which was developed for our colleagues. So by step actually guidance for how to do, where to click, how to change things, how to look where is the evidence table, also some brief explanation what all of this means, and then through the development, showing different features, how actually our colleagues could change if necessary, how to add new evidence, and how to make the final adopt judgment within it, which we're going through the part of recommendation. So when you are in development feature of the Grade Pro, as you can see on this slide, you just switch on the development, and then you can simply change and adopt and contextualize all what is already extracted on the RecMap, coming from evidence to decision tables, and of course also the ETD criteria and all of the parts. So this is just another examples from the guide. And finally, this is the process of development. So we were, also developing and basically double checking all what we've done with our team, and so there were some internal processes for it outside the Grade Pro as well. And this is a final example how it looks on the Grade Pro. So this is the clinical question or guideline question following the PICO format, some background and basic information. And here finally is the updated research evidence. You see translated one in this concrete case. And here was the example when there were something necessary to change. So within the Grade Pro feature, we translated the original recommendation, and within the additional considerations, we developed and justified our change, our development, and then translated it also to English language, as you can see on this example. And here is how it looks in our guideline framework. So there is the clinical question, there is a recommendation, there is a direct link to the RecMap, evidence tables, and all of the sources are here, and it's having the same layout like all other Czech national guidelines. So this is within, this is just example from the COVID-19 guidelines. So you see it's in Czech language and already ready. Development challenges we faced. Well, the first was the project setup page in Grade Pro, because when you have more guidelines, there is just one guideline which is displaying, but this is something what we discussed and will be probably changed. Then when changes are made during development, back translating to English, we promised we will do it. So that's was one of the challenges which is a bit delayed our process, but I believe this is important to also a little bit pay back what we got from the RecMap. That is not possible so far to translate PICO question, background information, and COI within the original guideline in Grade Pro, but you can of course do it externally, which is quite okay, but would be nice to have it in the Grade Pro. Also not possible to show the original source and agree scores on the recommendations directly in the Grade Pro, but you can do it in a RecMap. updating challenge. However, I think we figured it out that it's excellent that the RecMap team will give us alert when one of the source guidelines are updated. So then we can consider in our living guideline if this should be made immediately or it could wait. And also good practice statements, development and new development. This is challenge what we're now discussing. However, I think we already figured out within the executive team how to actually put on back to the map. And this is, I think, one of the most important slide, and it's the RecMap development advantages. What we have. Well, what are the advantages for us? Well, mainly the RecMap itself. It's systematic, it's living, weekly updated, sound methodology with prioritization, robust processes. It's for free, and there is a huge RecMap team support. So that is already existing the wheel. So really developing the guideline for the questions which I already answered were not smart from our part. So that was one of the main reasons why we decided to use the RecMap, because the evidence is there already. That is done. Agree assessment, everything is extracted in the Grade Pro already, including questions, summary of findings table, evidence reaching criteria, recommendation, justification. So all of these we can use and just simply modify. So that's the huge help and save for the time and resources. It's also, I would say, user-friendly. There is a living mode adoption on our side. So everything that is something changed, we will know it and we can immediately incorporate it. And now very briefly, just showing, summarizing what I said. So in the end, there is 8 guidelines, 72 recommendations, 11 GPS, 7 new guidelines developed, 7 new recommendations developed. Living mode. So we decided to update our guideline every time there is significant change and update, or at least every 2 months. So that's the current setup. Here you can see the main guideline areas of our Czech national guideline. So you see we choose just a small bit from what exists on the map, but I believe that many other will follow because there is a lot of materials on the map which could be used for different areas, not only clinical, but also from a public health point of view and many other point of views, let's say. This is our national guideline panel. So great thanks to all. You see the guideline panel was quite large with clinicians from different backgrounds, which was very important for us, for sure. So the big thanks to our colleagues who are working on this hard. And next steps for us, publication of first version during March, extension of topics and areas as needed, living mode at least 2 months or earlier if needed, and working within the RecMap on further user friendliness of our development function. So that's part to the end. Huge thank you for our development support to all eCovid-19 recommendation map project and team members from all over the world, I would say. So thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. And here is a small invitation for the postponed Global Evidence Summit 2023, which will be hosted in Prague. So thank you for listening and hope to see you all in Prague 2023.
Okay, so we'll open it up to questions now. So if you have any questions, please send it in the chat box.
Yeah, we are seeing a few comments. So thank you very much for very nice words. We have still some time, so there is a space for the questions. And I see that is the first question probably came. Yeah, and I see the question came from Joseph. So the question is, maybe Joseph, you can say yourself.
No, I was just trying to say that when people use the RecMap and they do want to do an development process, what exactly they should do, starting from scratch, or whom they should contact and things like that, because the development is not a button which is there on the thing. So I was just suggesting to Tamara to just mention it, so people would know. That is what.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I can probably answer this as well, and Tamara is welcome to add anything if I miss. Well, there is a development button. So under every recommendation, you can actually see on the RecMap the development button. And I would recommend this if you decide to do a development of 1, 2, or 3 recommendations. However, in our case, because we knew from the beginning that there will be much more recommendations we would like to adopt, so we decided to contact the team. So that is the contact form you can use within the RecMap, and then we set up the meeting with the team, and we explained our needs and proposals, and we agreed on how this should be done. So in the end, we identified on the RecMap all relevant recommendations, and we sent these links to the team, and they prepared for us the special separate project within the Grade Pro, and we were able then to actually work with it. Yeah, so I think there are several approaches. So my recommendation would be that if you use just single or few recommendations, you can use this development request, which is available within the RecMap after every recommendation. And if there is more, you would like to do something like us, the national guideline, that I would suggest that you contact the team and explain what are your needs from the RecMap, and I'm pretty sure that the colleagues will be very glad to help you. Tamara, anything else to add?
Thank you so much, Miroslav. This was great. I was just going to share my screen to show where we can request the development, if that's okay with the organizers. But again, thanks for describing your experiences, Miroslav and Joseph. And just like Miroslav explained, you can choose the recommendation that you would like to develop. We have a button that says request for development right next to it. And then our IT experts and Grade Pro leaders will directly link you to the project, and we will be available to help you with development.
Yeah, very good. I see a few more questions are coming. If the RecMap is, if you can access it from China, well, I think that RecMap is available everywhere, or should be, unless someone is blocking it. It's freely available to everyone, so everyone can search it, and it's very convenient. I'm doing it myself within my cell phone when I'm, for example, traveling somewhere, and there is something particularly interesting for me. Not necessarily for my field, but just some new features. I just I can check the RecMap from my cell phone very conveniently. I'm traveling by tram or train or anywhere else, so it's very easy. So it should be accessible for free for everyone now, and I think that's great. And I think in the meantime I can also show the screen and show the development button within the map. Looking for any other questions. What may be desired duration for allotment process? That from Hamamittal. Well, it really depends on what's the number of questions in the end and the processes on their side. For us, it took a little bit more time So it was, I think, 4 or 5 months in the end, but the reason was that we got quite large team. We had to first make some educational materials within the team to get them familiarized with the Grade Pro, with the RecMap itself, and it was quite a lot of recommendations actually. We were adoloping, but from my experience, if you do 1 or 2 recommendations, it could be pretty fast actually, and I would say it could be really question of days. Yeah, but it would depend on the processes. But if you develop it for national part, it could be really for local part, it could be really fast.
Yeah, there's another question about how much level of experience and expertise and guidelines is required for doing this development thing. And I think this comes from the background of the fact that why do a development in the first place? Uh, and I think from your experience, it suggests that there is a requirement of, pretty good level of expertise in that. Am I right, Miroslav?
Yeah, you are very right. Well, for our clinicians, that is not necessary, to have this expertise, but they need someone on a team who has this expertise, right? Especially if this is so complex as we did it in the end. On the other hand, the RecMap itself is following very robust methodology. So if you choose this recommendation, you see what's the agree score. So this is already appraised. So this is something typically we all do when we adopting guidelines. So first, we identify if the guideline is relevant, we identify if it's current, and also if it's of high quality. And that's we do by the assessing of the agree2 usually, or different tools, but agree2 is most popular. And this is already done. Also, what is done is the extraction in a typical guideline format, which is the PICO question. And it's then extracted according to the particular outcomes. So from my perspective, even without very good level of the understanding of guideline methodology, if you use something what is on the RecMap, you can use it with, let's say, some basic knowledge about it, because all of this is done in a robust way, and it could be used. So not necessarily to really be proficient in the guideline methodology, because this what is offered on the RecMap, there is already quite rigor methodological work behind it.
Yeah, and actually Yasser is asking pretty much something similar, whether there is a need for funding, etc., to do this development process, or is a team allowed to informally try this on their own? I think Tamara responded by saying that the RecMap team will help. But then Yasser is asking again if a voluntary group, not a formal group, an informal group wanted to try that, would it work or not? I think.
Yeah, so for these, the development function, I think I can answer this. Anyone can use it, yeah, and the team will help it within the RecMap project. So that would be no special resources from your side, because the team is ready to help and to help with the development. And on your side depends on the size of your project, of course. But for something smaller, you don't need many funds, I would say, to do such work. But it depends on what's the aim. If it's the local guidance or some national guideline development, as in our case, then this will be different.
Yeah, in the context of India, because there are some colleagues here, so what we're trying to do is an entirely different approach, as it were. We're looking at existing recommendations, and if they meet certain quality criteria, then we're asking ourselves as a group, can I use this as it is? It's yes or no. If it is yes, adopt it. If not, then why not? And then these things which I showed on those crowded slides is actually trying to highlight the fact that there are reasons why it cannot be used. And then we try and tweak those so it's not a formal development process, but it kind of gets done. And then finally we feed it into the elements of the ETD table and come out with a recommendation at the end of it. We're just trying and experimenting to see if that approach works, because it's less resource intensive and it saves a lot of time as well. But I can only tell you whether it worked or not in about 6 months from now. Just an
Exactly.
approach.
Very good. And here is, to answer the question about the adolopment request, it's very easy. So here is the list of recommendations. I see, for example, this recommendation is the recommendation I would like to adolop. So I click on this, and I hope I'm sharing the good screen. Hopefully, yeah. And when you click on this, here is the request for adolopment button. You see, it's quite visible. So you type the request button. You fill the simple form, send a request, and that's done. Then the team will contact you and now make you the environment within the Grade Pro. So that's a very simple process, and the request is really convenient. So anyone can use this.
I think there's an important question coming up, which is whether RecMap will be available for other diseases too. And I remember Holger mentioned that this whole thing started with the TB guidelines, and a RecMap was created for TB. And then COVID was kind of built on the learnings and experiences from that. But I don't know if we will have another one for diseases, though we're discussing that. Am I right, Tamara?
Yeah, I think I can answer this as well. It's very right. It was the first the TB RecMap around the WHO, and this I think was a pilot for the recommendations map, and we believe, or at least I believe, that this is the future of how we develop guidelines. For the fields where more guidelines exist or more guidelines are needed. So that's we can expect more recommendations maps will exist in a near future for different areas.
Okay, so thank you so much everyone for attending. I will share the link for our next webinar in the chat box, so you can go ahead and register. That will be on the 18th of March. And thank you so much. We hope to connect again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good one.